Hey there, welcome to IST. My name is Galen, and today I'm going to be teaching you about PC parts, essentially. So all the essentials for a PC and all the components inside of a PC that you can remove. So to start, we're going to make a list of everything that we need. You need a motherboard or an MB. All of this stuff is going to be explained in, fleshed out. So you have your CPU. You have your RAM, you have your GPU, you have your PSU, you have your storage, and then you have a case and fans, if we get to that. So a case and fans are very important, but we'll get to that another time if we don't have enough time today. But we will get over the basic components of a PC to get your PC up and running. So we're going to start off with the motherboard. Now the motherboard looks like a huge rectangle, and it has a slot in it that looks like this part here on the side is for your ports. And your ports are like your USB ports to plug in a mouse or keyboard. You have your audio ports for things like headphones or speaker or anything of the sort. And then you have your outputs like VGA and HDMI, which will output to a TV or a monitor so you can see what your piece is actually running. Now on the motherboard, you have your CPU, which we'll get to. You have your RAM, which we'll also get to. You have your chipset, which we'll talk about in just a second. And then you have your PCI Express slots, which we'll also get to in a second. Now, on the motherboard, there are a bunch of ports. I'm not going to draw all that because that is tedious work that will take too long. This video will be forever. So I will explain that tomorrow when we build a PC, which we will build a PC for under $1,000. You better stick around for that. It will be up on the channel tomorrow. So we're going to start off with the chipset. Now the chipset is what makes the motherboard a motherboard. Now for a chipset, if you want to buy a PC, there are two different tiers that are readily available as of November 2020. There's B450 and B550. B450 is the most readily available chipset that you can get. And 550 was recently released a couple of months ago, but they're still pretty much widely available for a more expensive price because it's newer. Now the B stands for business, because computer companies back in the early 2000s, when PCs were becoming more of a mainstream thing, named it business boards because of its high capacity for components and other stuff. So, and again, if you want to purchase a PC, go for a B450 in my opinion, because it's more readily available, it's slightly cheaper, and you don't need to switch it out in the coming years because all they'll need is an update for newer components. So, motherboard. Now, we're going to talk about the CPU now. Now, the CPU looks like this. It looks like a square inside of another square. And then the square, if you flip it over, there's pins. Now, there are pins that touch these pins on the CPU mount on the motherboard. And if pins are bent, because these are pins that are flat and flush with the CPU, but on the mount, it's actual CPU pins, like they're pins. So if you bend them, it might not work, and be very careful with your motherboards. Now, there are two leading companies that make CPUs. There's AMD and Intel. You've probably heard these names before if you watch TV or watch stuff with ads in it, because you've probably heard of Intel especially. Now, AMD and Intel are rivals, and at this point in time, as of November 2020, AMD is above Intel. But that might not be the case eventually. We might make a video on that at some point. So, AMD, they have a CPU line called Ryzen. And Ryzen has multiple tiers of price point performance. So you have your Ryzen 3, 5, 7, and 9. And these kind of speak for themselves. The higher the number, the more performance, but also the higher cost. And recently, Ryzen released their 5000 series, meaning that it's Ryzen 3 5600X or something like that, etc. Now, Intel has their Core series, meaning that it's the same thing as Ryzen, just the Intel version. So they have i3, i5, i7, and i9. And they're essentially the same thing as the Ryzen because, you know, higher price, higher performance for the higher number. So especially if you want to game, go for AMD, but if you want a more business side of PCs, go Intel. Because if you're buying like a bulk PC in bulk, or for an office, go for Intel because they're cheaper for that type of bundle thing and buying it in groups. That's why most PCs that you'll find in workplaces are Intel, not AMD. But AMD is also gaming oriented, and they probably don't want their workers slacking off. So, I'm just going to erase this. Okay, so next, we're going to talk about the RAM. And the RAM is also very important in your PC, as everything else is in your PC. So the RAM stands for Random Access Memory. And just by hearing that, you're probably thinking, oh, it probably just takes the random memory off of the stress of the hard drive or CPU. And you'd be correct, because once the RAM is installed, extra data, that's made from the computer, instead of going to the hard drive or the CPU, it'll go to the RAM, and then the RAM will expose of it and keep it, together. So, and there's an option for having 1, 2, 3, or 4 sticks of RAM. I suggest having a minimum of 2 sticks in your setup, because if you have only 1, you'll be running in something called single channel, and if you have 2, you have dual channel. And dual channel is much better than single channel because you're essentially running in a loop. You have 2 channels, and it's essentially just like a wishbone. It helps it, move the memory along, and it puts less stress on just one. And there are different frequencies and stuff like that, but we're going to get into that another time. Now, I suggest a minimum of 8 gigs of RAM. So 2 4-sticks, or 1 6-stick and 1 2-stick, just 8 gigs minimum. Next, we're going to talk about the GPU, or the Graphics Processing Unit. But we're just going to call it a graphics card, because that's what it is. It supports graphic capabilities and video output, meaning that instead of plugging, say, an HDMI cable into your port hub here, you have your you plug it into the back of the GPU, and then you plug it in there. So, what does the GPU look like? So, a GPU, this is one of the basic GPUs that one of the brands has made that we're going to talk about in a second. It looks like this. It's a block with a fan on it, and then it has a small little set of pins that we'll also get to later. Now, this is a basic looking graphics card, I know, but they get much more elaborate in their designs if you just look them up. So there are 2 leading brands in graphics cards. So you have NVIDIA, and you have our old friend AMD. Now NVIDIA is the top of the line, bang for your buck items for graphics cards. Now, if you want to get a AMD graphics card, if you want an AMD graphics card, get an AMD CPU, because there's a possibility that they might work hand in hand and you might get more of a performance boost from getting this a simultaneous running of the same system. But NVIDIA has two different I want to say branches of their graphics cards. You have your GTX and your RTX. Now, GTX is barely used anymore, but their cards are still readily available. But RTX is the latest and greatest. And NVIDIA just released their RTX 3000 series. No one could get their hands on them because 2 seconds after it went live, it sold out. I'm not kidding. So, but if you want to get a graphics card the coming months or the coming weeks, I suggest going for RTX 2000 series, and I suggest either a 2060 or a 2080. Now, you can get a 2070 and go right in between, but there are some limitations to having a 2070 because it's like that mid-range point, so you might get some graphic dips and stuff like that. But each set of graphics cards has a different set of has a different, like, I want to say like a upgradable version. Like, you know how like the PS4 Pro is to the PS4, or the Xbox One X and S is to the Xbox One. So you have your 2060 and 2070 and 2080. Your 2060, you have 2060 Super. Same thing with the 2070, you have your Super. But once it gets to the 2080, it's called the TI. It's all the same, it's an upgraded version of that basic card. Now, it is more expensive, but again, higher price, more performance in most cases. And AMD has their line of graphics cards called Radeon, which is essentially the same thing as NVIDIA, except made by a different brand. Now, each graphics card brand has different brands that they associate with that manufacture the cards. Now, you might have one that's from MSI, or one that's from Gigabyte, or one that's from even a brand like Corsair. They're all the same, essentially. Just pick AMD or NVIDIA, and then go. Just look. You'll find one eventually that you'll want to get, and they all have different styles. So we're just going to get rid of this. Alright. Next is our PCU, or our power supply unit, or just a power supply. Now, a power supply, again, is very, very important, because if you don't have a power supply, you can't even turn on the PC. Now, your power supply is where you plug in the cable that you plug into the wall or power strip, and then it has a switch on it that turns it on and off. Now, having a power supply has watts, meaning that it has a certain amount of electrical frequency that it can take before it just absolutely dies. And there are different tiers of that. If you have anything under 550 watts, ditch it. Because now that PCs are getting more and more sophisticated and easier, and not easier, and more powerful and more power consuming, 550 won't get you by in 2020 unless you go for old parts. I suggest anything above 750, anything above, you're golden, you're good. Because not only is it going to run everything smoothly, it's going to give you some upgradability in the future. Now, there are different tiers of power supply. So the certification system they have is called 80 plus. And 80 plus meaning, what it's capable of in the sense of how much tolerance it can take. You have bronze, silver, gold, platinum, and titanium. And like I've been saying, the higher, the more expensive it is, the higher it might be. I suggest going for silver or a gold 80 plus because that's a good middle ground to have. Now power supplies, don't get a cheap one. If you cheap out on a power supply, your whole PC might go kaboom. So don't do that. So next up, we have your storage. Now storage is very important in more than one aspect. You have two forms of storage. You have your hard drives, like those silver hard drives that you see, and then you have your SSD, or solid state drive. Now, solid state is good for loading stuff super fast. So if you want, say, a really fast load time of Windows, get something called a M.2 SSD, and it looks like this. Now this is an M.2 SSD, and this is mainly used for loading Windows and nothing more, nothing less. But you can add more M.2 storage to have it be your main functionality of it and not have a regular size 2.5-inch hard drive. But if you would like, anything is available. But one thing I do not suggest going for a Windows loader is a hard disk drive, or HDD. Now, you'll see that most of the hard drives that you find, in like thrift stores or like tag sales or something like that will be hard drives. And these, if you get them used, super unreliable and they're super slow to load. That's why I suggest getting a M.2 SSD or a regular SSD for booting Windows and just in general loading the computer. So now that we are done with storage, I'm going to give you a back view of the computer before going into our last thing. So the back of the computer looks like this. It's not to scale. So you have your ports, or they're also called /IO. You can call them your IO or your ports, whatever. So this is where you have your HDMI, your USB for mice and keyboards, output, audio, stuff like that. And then you have a fan, which is right here, and then there's another one right here, which is your fans that circulate air throughout the system. Then you have your power supply down here usually, and then there's your port there, and then you have the cable running through. But right here is very important, right here around the case. You have your covers for your PCI Express slots. Now, PCI Express are these little slots here, and they look like this. Essentially they look like cartridge slots from an old Nintendo system. So what you do is you take the graphics card and you put it in, you slot it in there, plug in the power cable from the power supply into the graphics card, and then your graphics card is complete. So what it means, PCIe, there's a bunch of different terms and a bunch of different things. If you look it up, good luck finding what it means because I couldn't find it. I'm probably just not observant. But what I like to call it is a expansion slot, because that's exactly what it is. An expansion slot essentially gives your PC more capabilities. So in this top one here, or the second one, you will go for, usually that's where you put your graphics card, because that's your big boy, so you're going to put at the top. Then the next ones will either be, say you want like a USB hub for plugging in more peripherals, or you want, say, a Wi-Fi card because you don't have access to a wired internet connection, so you have to enable Wi-Fi, wireless internet. You can do that. Essentially, expansion is endless. that if you can find it or program it yourself, most likely you can find a card or make a card that has that stuff. Now, on the back of the PC, you take out, these are little metal pieces usually, or plastic pieces or something. You either unscrew them and take them out, or some PCs have plastic bits where you just tear them off completely. And once you take that off, then your graphics card will show the ports, or its vents, or your other expansion slots will do their thing, like a Wi-Fi card or a USB hub. And then, after you plug it in and press the power button, your PC is up and running. Now, that's essentially all I have for you today. That's all I have for you guys today. So, now you know the PC basics. I will go over more tomorrow when we build our under $1,000 PC, so enjoy that. And yeah, that's all I have for you guys today. I'll see you later.